While my daughter was supposed to be playing in the room, her crying echoed through the house. I hurried into the large living room where the relatives had gathered and was momentarily stunned by what I saw. There, surrounded by drunken relatives, was my mother-in-law, Carol, straddling my sobbing daughter while holding something in her hand. "What are you doing?" I frantically pulled Carol away from my daughter. Carol shook her shoulders, glaring at me with a furious expression. "My name is Emily Davis, 33 years old. Currently, I live in New York with my husband, James, and our 5-year-old daughter, Chloe. I used to work full-time, but I switched to a part-time job when I got pregnant with Chloe. Chloe has been an easy child to raise, growing up to be a wonderful kid. James is kind and always cares for both Chloe and me. Every day felt fulfilling, but there were a few times a year when I was filled with anxiety. The reason was my relationship with my mother-in-law. James' family home was in a small town surrounded by forests in Montana, and after my father-in-law passed away, Carol lived there alone. It took over 2 hours by car just to get to the nearest town, and from New York, the trip required a flight. Yet, every time something came up, Carol would gather all the relatives for a big feast. If Carol had been a considerate mother-in-law, there would have been no issue, however. She loved picking on her daughters-in-law, and for some reason, I was always her main target. James is the youngest of 3 siblings, and his 2 older brothers are already married. They always return home with their wives and kids during these gatherings. Carol did make unpleasant remarks to my sisters-in-law, but her treatment of me was on another level. Unlike my sisters-in-law, who seemed unaffected by Carol's remarks, I couldn't respond at all, which probably made bullying me more enjoyable for her. The reason I couldn't stand up to Carol was because of something that happened during a previous visit. As soon as I arrived at the family home and sat down to rest, Carol suddenly shouted,
"What are you sitting around for?"
She forced all the housework onto me. Of course, James and his brothers tried to stand up for me, but Carol wouldn't listen. I also didn't want to make James worry, so I pretended I was fine. However, at one point, when I was completely exhausted, I sat down in the kitchen for a moment. Carol caught me and, shouting, "Don't slack off!" she struck me with a broom so hard that it left a bruise. Carol laughed hysterically as she watched me wince in pain. That incident left me terrified of her, and I lost the courage to fight back. I also struggled to get along with my sisters-in-law. From the first time we met, they gave me the cold shoulder. On top of that, they often bossed me around or responded harshly whenever I spoke to them. Carol was also skilled at winning over those around her, spreading rumors that I was an incompetent wife who didn't care about her. The relatives, who believed her every word, were completely on her side. Apart from James, I had no allies in that house. Eventually, Chloe began to look unhappy whenever we had to visit James' family. Perhaps, in Chloe's eyes, it looked like her mom was being bullied by her grandmother. I felt guilty, but had no choice. This time, the occasion was James' father's memorial service. Skipping the trip was unthinkable unless there was an urgent reason. But honestly, there was never any real option to decline. I would soon come to regret not realizing what Chloe truly felt. On the day of the trip, James unexpectedly got called into work. He explained the situation to Carol, saying he'd join us the next day, but Carol insisted.
Emily, you need to come ahead to help with the preparations. It's unthinkable for the daughter-in-law to skip helping at a memorial service.
Carol wouldn't listen to James' words. I knew exactly what her plan was, but once she made up her mind, nothing could change it. Reluctantly, Chloe and I went to Montana alone. The journey was dread for me. James had promised he'd come as soon as his work was over. But visiting James' family without him felt like walking into enemy territory unarmed. Even Chloe seemed unusually quiet. I tried to act cheerful so that Chloe wouldn't worry. We took an early morning flight and arrived at the house just after noon. As I opened the door, thinking about how far the trip was, Carol immediately came to greet me.
You're late. What were you doing?
I had informed her of our arrival time beforehand, but Carol pretended not to remember. I had no choice but to apologize. Carol snorted and handed me a piece of paper.
Here, go buy everything on this list for dinner.
The note was packed with items. All of this. By myself. Carol scoffed. Your sisters-in-law aren't here yet. Of course, you're the one who has to go.
I'll watch Chloe, so hurry up and get going.
She practically forced me out of the house. When I called out to Chloe, who had been happily playing with the other kids, she looked at me with a sad expression. However, dragging a 5-year-old around for errands felt too cruel. Staying and playing would help keep her mind occupied. I told Chloe, I'll be back soon, borrowed a relative's car, and rushed to the store. No matter how fast I drove, the trip from Carol's house to the town supermarket took at least 30 minutes one way. By the time I finished all the shopping and returned, it was almost evening.
Everyone's already here, so get dinner ready now.
Despite seeing how exhausted I was, she complained, "You're late," and didn't let me rest for a second. When I handed her the receipt from the shopping trip, Carol crumpled it up and threw it at me, shouting, "What kind of wife begs her mother-in-law for money?" She muttered under her breath as she walked back to another room. I didn't have the luxury of casually paying hundreds of dollars out of pocket, so I stared at the receipt and let out a heavy sigh. But I gave up on the idea of getting reimbursed, unloaded the groceries, and began cooking dinner. Even while I was cooking, Carol found something to complain about every step of the way. I wished she'd at least help, but instead, I quickly prepared enough food for everyone and started setting it out on the table where the relatives, already tipsy, were gathered and laughing. Feeling concerned about Chloe, I peeked into the room and saw her happily playing in the corner with the other kids. I felt a sense of relief and continued working non-stop. About an hour later, while I was preparing drinks in the kitchen, I heard Chloe's desperate cry coming from the room. Startled by the sound of Chloe's cry, I rushed into the room where everyone was gathered and saw Carol pinning Chloe down, trying to draw something on her face with a crayon that one of the kids had been holding. James' brothers seemed like they were about to step in, but the other relatives laughed and egged Carol on. I was shocked at the bizarre scene, but I quickly regained my senses and forcefully pulled Carol away from Chloe. The force caused Carol to fall backward onto the floor.
What do you think you're doing?
Carol's angry voice echoed through the room. What did you do to Chloe?
She's as ugly as her mother, so I was just trying to make her look cuter.
The smell of alcohol coming from Carol was nauseatingly strong. Even after all that, Carol didn't show a hint of remorse and kept throwing insults at me in front of everyone. Disgusted with everyone in the room, I scooped up my crying daughter, grabbed my belongings, and stormed out of the house. After leaving Carol's house, I checked Chloe to make sure she wasn't hurt, and through her tears, she told me what had happened. What she said left me heartbroken. Apparently, every time we visited, Carol had been bullying Chloe behind my back. She kept it to herself, fearing that if she told me, Carol would bully me even more. With her small body, she had been silently enduring it all this time. Chloe kept saying, "I'm sorry," over and over. But I was the one who needed to apologize. How had I not noticed until now? I felt like I had failed as a mother. Holding my trembling daughter tightly, all I could do was apologize. I immediately called James. He was just finishing his work and was already planning to head to Carol's house. When I told James that we had left his mother's house, he was shocked, but sensing that something serious had happened, he quickly booked a hotel near the airport. A few hours later, I met James in the hotel lobby. Once we got to the room, Chloe fell asleep almost instantly, as if relieved to be safe. I finally felt calm enough to tell James everything, what Carol had been doing to me all this time and what had happened that day. At first, James couldn't believe it, but when I handed him something I kept as proof, his whole body shook.
Emily, I'm so sorry for everything you've endured.
With tears streaming down his face, he bowed his head deeply. I could endure it if it was just me, but knowing Chloe has been hurt, I can't stay quiet about this. I couldn't stop crying either. I felt overwhelmed with regret, wondering how I hadn't noticed what was happening to Chloe sooner. James understood exactly how I felt.
We're cutting ties with my mom. I can't stay silent after what she did to our daughter.
I was grateful for James' words. He chose us over his own mother. Cutting ties with Carol was something I had always wanted. Leaving things unresolved would only hurt Chloe more. But cutting ties alone wouldn't be enough to ease my heart. Sensing how I felt, James looked at me and said this.
Let's call your dad.
He picked up the phone and called my dad. I realized that relying on my dad might be the best solution. And so, we began making preparations to sever ties with Carol for good. A few days later, my doorbell rang, followed by a loud bang. Bang! At the door. I already knew who it was. I immediately sent a message to James, who was at work, via WhatsApp, and when I opened the front door, there Carol, just as I had expected. She was already seething with rage. Without saying a word, she stormed into the house and barked.
What's the meaning of this?
She threw an envelope at me. It represents how James and I feel. The envelope contained proof of the numerous times Carol had harassed me and documents for a formal demand for compensation. The truth was, I had been secretly wearing a voice recorder during my visits with Carol, just in case I needed evidence. The reason I had started doing this was because of my dad. My dad, a lawyer, had always taught me to keep records if anything ever happened. This advice turned out to be invaluable, as I was able to compile solid evidence of Carol's harassment. James also understood the situation after hearing the recordings. Moreover, my parents, who adored Chloe more than anything, were furious when they learned Carol had even bullied their granddaughter. They immediately took action. As stated in the documents, we're demanding compensation. The amount was $20,000. Although it felt a bit high, my dad explained that it also covered Chloe's suffering, so I agreed it was justified. However, Carol shouted back,
"Why should I pay compensation? You two are trying to frame me, but it won't work."
She ranted nonstop, saying things like, "I've done nothing wrong," and "it's the mother-in-law's duty to teach her daughter-in-law," without pausing for breath. In the end, she even threatened me, saying, "Don't think you'll get away with this. And the relatives won't stay quiet about this either. Do whatever you like. We're cutting ties with all of you, so it doesn't matter anymore." When I said that, Carol froze for a moment before she lost control and started grabbing whatever was nearby and throwing it at me. As I calmly reflected that it was a good thing Chloe was with my parents, I suddenly heard James' voice.
Mom, stop. What the hell are you doing?
Carol whipped around, visibly startled. No wonder she hadn't expected to see her son standing there. James had been nearby for work, and after seeing my message, he informed his office and rushed home. His face was flushed with anger. Carol began shaking her head, trying to make excuses. But there was no way James would listen now.
I know everything you've done. I don't care if you're my mother. If you hurt my family, I won't forgive you. We're done. I'm cutting ties with you from today.
It was the first time Carol had seen James yell like that. She was taken aback at first, but she quickly snapped back and shouted,
"You can't do that. The family won't stay quiet about this. Your brothers are all on my side."
She seemed to believe that saying this would make us back down. Then she started ranting that I had brainwashed James and demanded that I beg for forgiveness. As I watched her outburst with cold detachment, I heard the voice of James' oldest brother, Mark.
"We're cutting ties with you too."
Carol turned around, stunned, to see Mark and James' other brother standing there with their wives. Carol's mouth opened and closed as if she couldn't find any words. James' brothers had grown suspicious of Carol's behavior and had come over to hear the truth. I'd play the recordings for them, just as I had for James. Hearing everything, James' brothers were furious, and that was when Carol showed up, unfortunately for her.
"This is all a setup. You're only making me look bad because you hate me."
Carol started shedding fake tears as she desperately tried to explain herself to James' brothers and even turned to their wives, pleading, "You're on my side, right?" But the sisters-in-law scoffed and said, "It's pointless." Carol's face turned pale at their response. The sisters-in-law had completely taken my side. After fleeing Carol's house that day, I was wondering how I would make the over 2-hour drive to the town with the airport when Jane, Mark's wife, showed up to help me. At first, I thought she was going to take me back to Carol's house, but instead, she apologized for not being able to stop Carol earlier. When I explained everything to her, she secretly drove me to the town. On the way, Jane told me about her own experiences with Carol. Before I married into the family, the sisters-in-law had also endured similar mistreatment, though not to the same extent as me. Jane admitted that they had wanted to reach out to me but could never get close because Carol was always watching. She told me that she had tried to confront Carol before, but it only made Carol treat me even worse afterward. And since then, she hadn't been able to say anything or even talk to Mark about it. But this time, as a mother herself, she couldn't stand by any longer and told James' brothers everything. Knowing how hard my sisters-in-law had worked behind the scenes to protect me brought me to tears. Thanks to Jane and the others, James' brothers finally took action. Everyone believed my words and supported me. There was no one left who sided with Carol.
I've done nothing wrong.
Even after everything, Carol still refused to admit her faults. And Mark, the eldest brother, yelled at her, "Cut it out!" Mark looked so much like their late father-in-law. Perhaps Carol saw her husband in him at that moment. After being yelled at, Carol burst into tears like a child and finally pleaded, "Please forgive me." But I had no intention of ever forgiving her. I told her it was impossible. Then she snapped again, saying, "If you don't forgive me, my sons will cut ties with me. Are you trying to take my precious boys away from me?" Hearing that, the anger I had been suppressing boiled over, and I said, "What about the fact that you hurt my precious daughter? As a mother yourself, you should understand how I feel." I let everything out in a rush, and James had to desperately hold me back. He must have thought I was about to lunge at Carol. When James told Carol, "Give it up," she staggered and collapsed on the spot. Even as I watched her like that, I felt nothing. If it had only been me, I might have endured it, but I could never forgive someone who had hurt my daughter. James' brothers, utterly fed up, sighed and said, "Let's go," as they began to take Carol away. As she reluctantly followed them, I smiled and said, "We've sent copies of these documents to all the relatives. Hopefully, you still have some supporters left." Carol's eyes widened in shock as she looked at me. She let out a strange cry and began thrashing around again. It was her last desperate attempt, but James' brothers dragged her out and took her home. I never saw Carol again after that. Shortly after, we formally severed ties with her with the support of James' brothers. The relatives who learned of Carol's true nature also began distancing themselves from her. However, I had no intention of forgiving the relatives who stood by and laughed while my daughter was being mistreated. Word spread about Carol's abusive behavior toward her daughters-in-law, and she ended up completely isolated. Having grown up in a small, close-knit town with no outside connections, Carol must have found it unbearable and lonely. Before cutting ties, one of my sisters-in-law told me the reason she had been so harsh to me. It was an incredibly childish reason. She said I looked exactly like her first love's girlfriend, which made her irrationally upset whenever she saw me. Realizing that Chloe and I had been dragged into such a selfish grudge made me feel more incredulous than angry. I truly felt relieved that we had cut ties with her. Through Mark, we received the compensation money from Carol, and we quietly moved to a new home. James' brothers also started making plans to move in case Carol tried anything again. To this day, we still have a good relationship with James' brothers and their families. A few times a year, we all get together to catch up. I came to realize that the sisters-in-law I once thought were cold were actually kind people, and now they've become some of my greatest supporters. When I see Chloe laughing and playing with her cousins, I feel a sense of peace. I've made a vow to myself to protect my daughter, no matter what happens from now on.